This is podcast number 1 for History 243, week 8, made in the spring of 2020. My name is Mickey Pohl. I teach at Vassar College in the history department. Hey everyone. In this podcast, I would like to talk about some of the artists that were widely discussed and listened to during the war years in Russia. One of them is Shostakovich. He embodies a lot of artistic struggle in the USSR, like the shifts from 1920s experimental culture to socialist realism. Socialist realism was the Stalinist culture method in quotation marks, what all culture, film, music, painting all had to boil down to by the 1930s, but you can't just reduce him to that. I found it difficult to focus on him as a student. I had some Soviet records, and I loved my records, and I played them, but I liked none of the pieces by Shostakovich. And the text in Russian, it was difficult to read, and it wasn't worth reading. It revealed nothing of his struggles. It was just sort of Soviet officialese about the music. It's a lot easier to study him now with everything digitized. Take his first publicly performed piece. It was written at age 19. It was the equivalent of a senior thesis. This was written in 1926, and Shostakovich continued to experiment in the 1920s. He worked at a youth theater, he wrote film music, and he wrote operas. In 1936, one of his compositions came to Stalin's attention. Stalin wanted sensible art, understood by all. A sort of Reader's Digest style, realistic, yeah, but everything surrounded by a soft glow, even the most violent concepts. So back to the story. Stalin attends this opera, one of the most popular operas by Shostakovich, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, about a woman who has an affair and then becomes a murderess. Lady Macbeth kills her father-in-law, and she kills her husband too. And the last act is set in a Siberian labor camp. The music is multi-layered, dense with ironic references to popular and folk tunes and even to vulgar music from prisons. The opera created a paradoxical figure, at least for the revolution. Lady Macbeth was an innocent murderess, a criminal, but also a romantic. Stalin visited. He sat in a private box, while Shostakovich sat in the audience in fear, white as a sheet. Stalin was there with an entourage, with a bunch of other party bosses. They were eating and drinking and laughing so that people in the audience could hear it. They winced at every atonal and shrill sound. And then the worst happened. They left early. A few days after this, an anonymous review of Lady Macbeth came out. It said the Soviet people expect good songs and good operas, but that this opera was vulgar and bourgeois, that it endangered Soviet music, that it was a formalism and a leftist distortion. Lady Macbeth's success abroad was only further proof that it was bourgeois, and that Shostakovich was not a class-conscious composer, but too introspective, and that he ignored the demands of Soviet culture. Was it a model or was it music? Stalin wrote. Oops, the anonymous reviewer wrote. This led to a huge, twisted, authoritarian turning point typical of those times. Countless artists now had to say exactly the same thing and condemn Lady Macbeth and Shostakovich. Making people condemn Shostakovich and his bourgeois and formalist opera became one of the main tools of enforcing socialist realism in music. It was like an oath that people took, other artists, that is. After that, Shostakovich had to walk a fine line. The opera was pulled, he was in the crosshairs, he was denounced, the NKVD tapped his telephone, but he was probably too famous to be arrested. He lived in isolation, holed up in Leningrad. Everyone around him was arrested during the Great Terror, including his patron in the Communist Party, Tukhachevsky, the marshal, and many of his relatives. But then he was rehabilitated a little before the war started. The 5th and 6th Symphony of his were performed. He was not arrested as long as he did what he was told and toed the line. One example of that is that he wrote military marches for the unsuccessful Winter War. He was ashamed of them, and they were never performed or published during his lifetime. Our book discusses Shostakovich's 7th. This symphony was important because it told the Germans, we, the people of Leningrad, are still here. It was aimed at the Germans. As we know from our reading, culture did not stop during the siege. Leningraders embraced it, and it's through the lens of culture that the intelligentsia remembers the siege. Libraries, theaters stayed open and helped with mental health. People did drawings and paintings during the siege and years later to deal with the memory and with the events that happened. I want to play you some clips from a Music Experts podcast. It's from an episode of Decomposed called Symphony for a Starving City. I encourage you to look at the podcast in its entirety at decomposedshow.org.
As thousands of people fled, Shostakovich stayed. He wanted to enlist to fight in the Red Army, but he couldn't. Bad eyesight. So he volunteered with the firefighting brigade instead. He was assigned to watch the city from the rooftops, to extinguish bombs as they fell. In this uproar, as the Germans barreled toward them, he began writing his 7th symphony. When you look at his sheet music from this time, there are notations in the margins. VT. It stands for Vozdushnaya Tryovoga. That's Russian for air raid alarm. Every time he was interrupted by the bombings, Shostakovich marked his spot with a VT. He would gather his papers and take them down into the shelter with his family. In all this doom, the bombings, The growing food lines, the shrinking supplies, Shostakovich became a symbol of hope for the city. He'd essentially been an enemy of the state just 5 years before, but now he was a hero. There was a photo of him in his firefighting uniform, overlooking the city like a mythic guardian. Suddenly, he was propaganda. The city's radio station asked him on to talk about this new symphony, to help boost morale. What he was doing was the ultimate act of defiance, to still be creating art when the Germans were threatening death. Shostakovich's voice went out on the radio waves across Leningrad. He said, "An hour ago, I finished scoring the second movement of my latest large orchestral composition. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this so that the people of Leningrad listening to me will know that life goes on in our city." Where the NBC Radio Orchestra performed it after only 4 rehearsals. The Seventh Symphony was broadcast across the United States in July of 1942. Shostakovich was heard from coast to coast. And it wasn't just played once. The Seventh Symphony was performed more than 50 times across the U.S. that year. Shostakovich's face was on the cover of Time magazine. For a moment, for the people close to it, the music made Russia's fight feel like America's fight. A conductor in Cleveland said the symphony captured victory over barbarism. That Leningrad Symphony that stirred the Americans, it still had to be played in Leningrad. The score was flown into the city by plane, and when it arrived, the conductor saw it and his heart sank. It was so dense, so long, it seemed impossible to play. The Seventh Symphony is designed to be played by an orchestra of over 100 musicians. 15 showed up for the first rehearsal. They were almost too weak to play, but they were willing to try. The conductor had to pull musicians from the Red Army to boost their numbers. It took months to prepare. 3 members of the orchestra died while waiting to play the Seventh Symphony. But finally, the premiere was set for August 9th. They knew that the venue would be a target, that the Germans would strike at any act of defiance. So the Red Army struck first. The day of the concert, they dropped 3,000 shells on the German army to distract them. And at Grand Philharmonia Hall in Leningrad, the musicians played on. The conductor stood in front of the orchestra, so thin that his formal tailcoat hung off him, and he urged his musicians through the symphony, through each movement, to the end. The Seventh Symphony does not have an ending of pure triumph. There's still darkness there. You can hear it. But it must have, in that moment, felt so powerful to be making all that music. Music that filled the hall. Music that was being broadcast through the city by loudspeakers. They blared the symphony across the landmines and the barbed wire that ringed the city. They aimed the music right at the Germans to be sure that they could hear it hunkered down in their trenches, making sure they would remember the Symphony of Leningrad.
In 1948, Shostakovich, along with many other composers, was again denounced for formalism. But he survived to 1975. He was age 69. In his 60s, he was even at his most extreme and abstract, at least for the Soviet listener. He wrote many more operas and symphonies. This includes one about the Holocaust that is much less known than his Leningrad Symphony. But this is not what people listened to during the war. During the war, ordinary people preferred simpler songs. They listened to tango, to waltzes. Let me read you these lyrics, and then I'll play you a clip, and come back after the clip. It's from a song called The Blue Scarf by Claudia Shulzhenko. I recall this evening when your scarf fell down, how you saw me off and promised to keep the blue scarf. And even though you're not with me today, I know that you still wrap the blue scarf around your head.
Помню, как памятный вечер падал платочек твой с плеч, как провожала и обещала синий платочек сберечь. И пусть со мной нет сегодня любимой, родной, знаю, с любовью ты безголовою прячешь платок дорогой. Письма твои получая, слышу я голос родной, и между строчек синий платочек снова встает предо мной. И часто в бой провожает меня блик твой. Чувствую рядом с любящим взглядом ты постоянно со мной.
Finally, I want to play you some examples of music to which people remembered the war already from a distance, written a couple of decades later. One example is Bratske Mogily, written in 1964. No crosses are put on mass graves. No widows come here to cry. Some people bring flowers and keep the flame burning. But does that make it lighter to bear?
На братских могилах не ставят крестов, и вдовы на них не рыдают. К ним кто-то приносит букеты цветов, и вечный огонь зажигают. Здесь раньше вставала земля на дыбы, а нынче гранитные плиты. Здесь нет ни одной персональной судьбы, все судьбы в единую слиты.
Okay, that's it for my first podcast for History 243. I'm going to upload a video of that song by Vladimir Vysotsky, Bratske Mogily, and the text too in translation. please look at Moodle and please respond to either the book Leningrad or to the current events by either making a drawing or a short cartoon, or by writing a short poem, or making a Wordle. You can take words from the book and just jumble them up in a Wordle. The site is www.wordle.net. Send images to me as a JPEG or as a PDF. You can send text to me in a number of different ways, and label it clearly with your name and the week and the number of the course, if you could, please. That's it. I'll talk to you later.
Много девушек хороших, как много ласковых имен, но лишь одна из них тревожит, унося покой и сон, когда влюблен. Любовь нечаянно на грани, когда ее совсем не ждешь, и каждый вечер сразу станет удивительно хорош, и ты поешь, сердце, тебе не хочется покоя. Сердце, как хорошо на свете жить. Сердце, как хорошо, что ты такое. Спасибо, сердце, что ты умеешь так любить. Сердце, как хорошо, что ты такое. Спасибо, сердце, что ты умеешь так любить.